The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and fire, while a warm breeze swept across the vast African plains. The dry rustle of the tall grass was interrupted only by the distant cry of a hunting eagle. But for Kwame, a seasoned ranger at Lyando Reserve, there was something different about this evening, something unsettling. His sharp instincts picked up a sound, a low, ragged growl, thick with pain. He froze, listening carefully. Moving cautiously through the golden grass, he spotted a sight that made his stomach tighten. A massive lion, his thick golden mane streaked with blood, lay motionless on the ground, trapped in a cruel tangle of barbed wire. His powerful body had lost its strength, and his half-closed eyes flickered with agony. Kwame swallowed hard. He knew this lion, Rafiki, one of the most feared and respected kings of the savannah, the leader of a mighty pride. Now he was helpless, a victim of the ruthless snares set by poachers. The twisted metal had cut deep into his flesh, leaving open wounds. If Kwame didn't free him soon, infection would spread, sealing his fate. But there was a bigger problem. He wasn't alone. Lifting his gaze, Kwame saw shadows emerging from the tall grass. 6 lionesses. They encircled him, watching in eerie silence, their golden eyes locked onto the man who dared approach their fallen leader. Nala, Zuberi, Ayana, Tandy, Sefu, and Amara, Rafiki's fierce and loyal companions. Their sleek, muscular bodies were tense, their expressions unreadable. Sweat trickled down Kwame's forehead. He knew that one wrong move could mean his death, but he also knew that hesitation would doom Rafiki. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. He slowly kneeled beside the wounded lion, feeling the animal's labored breathing. Rafiki's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, locking onto Kwame's. There was no anger, no hostility, just pain, just a silent plea for help. Murmuring soft, reassuring words, Kwame gently placed a hand on Rafiki's thick mane and pulled a sharp knife from his belt. The blade glinted under the last light of the setting sun. With delicate precision, he began slicing through the barbed wire, trying to ignore the 6 sets of unblinking eyes fixed on him. Then suddenly, a deep, rumbling sound cut through the air. One of the lionesses growled, a low, menacing warning. Kwame froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. This could be the end. And that was the moment when everything changed. If you want to know what happens next and never miss an exciting story like this, leave a like now and subscribe to the channel. This way, you support our work and help spread these incredible stories around the world. Kwame's breath hitched as the lioness took another step forward. Amara, the most dominant of the group, lowered her head slightly, her muscles coiling like springs. Her deep amber eyes locked onto his, unreadable yet brimming with warning. The others stood tense, their tails flicking in agitation. Kwame knew what this meant. He was trespassing in their world, touching their king. If they deemed him a threat, they would not hesitate to strike. Still crouched beside Rafiki, Kwame fought to keep his hands steady as he continued sawing through the twisted metal. The barbed wire resisted, digging further into the lion's torn flesh. Rafiki let out a guttural groan, his massive body trembling beneath the strain. A fresh wave of blood seeped into the dry earth. Kwame winced. He needed to be faster. The air grew thick with tension. The lionesses fanned out, forming a semicircle around him, their predatory instincts sharpening with each passing second. Kwame knew they were watching his every move, waiting for an excuse to act. His mind raced. If they attacked, could he even reach for his tranquilizer rifle in time? No, he was too close, too exposed. His only chance was to finish the job before their patience ran out. With a final, desperate pull, the last strand of barbed wire snapped free. Rafiki let out a shuddering breath, his body collapsing fully onto the dirt. Kwame barely had a moment to react before he felt a shift in the air. Amara lunged. His body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to run. But instead, he did the unthinkable. He stayed still. The lioness stopped inches from him, her powerful form towering over his crouched body. Her breath was hot against his face. Kwame didn't move, didn't blink. If she wanted him dead, it would be over in a second. But then, she did something he never expected. Instead of attacking, Imara turned her attention to Rafiki. One by one, the other lionesses followed, stepping past Kwame as if he no longer existed. A shiver ran down his spine as realization struck. He had been accepted, if only for this moment. But the danger wasn't over yet. Rafiki was still too weak to stand, and the night was closing in fast. Kwame had risked everything to free him, but could he save him before it was too late? Kwame's pulse pounded as he watched Imara nudge Rafiki's massive body with her nose. The lion's breath was shallow, his muscles twitching as he tried and failed to move. He was free from the barbed wire, but far from safe. His wounds ran deep, and without treatment, infection would claim him before the night was over. The lionesses circled closer, their anxious eyes flicking between their fallen leader and the man who had dared to touch him. Kwame reached for his radio with careful, deliberate movements. One wrong move and everything could spiral into chaos. Static crackled as he pressed the button. "This is Kwame. I need urgent medical assistance near the northern boundary. Large male lion, severe lacerations, possible infection risk. Over." The response came quickly, a promise of help, but they were miles away. He was on his own until then. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He needed to stop the bleeding. His medical kit was strapped to his back, but reaching for it meant taking his eyes off the lionesses. He slowly shifted, retrieving a small bottle of antiseptic and clean gauze. As he poured the liquid over Rafiki's wounds, the lion flinched violently, letting out a deep, pained growl. The reaction was instant. The lionesses tensed, their ears flattening, tails lashing. Their leader was in distress, and Kwame was the reason. Imara let out a warning snarl. The air between them turned electric, heavy with unspoken threats. Kwame knew he had to act fast. If they lost trust in him now, he wouldn't get a second chance. He dropped the antiseptic bottle and raised both hands in a slow, calming motion. "I'm helping," he murmured, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. The lionesses didn't move, their piercing eyes locked onto his. The tension stretched tight, a fragile thread, ready to snap. Then, something shifted. Rafiki let out a long, rattling exhale and, with a supreme effort, lifted his head. His golden eyes, still clouded with exhaustion, landed on Kwame. A beat passed, then another, and finally, Rafiki did the unthinkable. He let his head fall against Kwame's leg. The gesture was small, barely a movement, but it was enough. The lionesses hesitated, their rigid postures softening just slightly. Kwame felt a surge of hope, but there was no time to celebrate. The real battle had only just begun. Rafiki was still too weak to stand, and the night was closing in fast. If the rescue team didn't arrive soon, survival might not be an option. Kwame could feel the night creeping over the savannah, swallowing the last streaks of gold in the sky. The temperature was dropping, and Rafiki was growing weaker by the second. Every shallow breath the lion took rattled like dry leaves in the wind. The antiseptic had slowed the bleeding, but without proper treatment, infection would set in. Kwame clenched his jaw. Where was the rescue team? The lionesses sensed the shift. Amara's ears twitched, her amber eyes scanning the horizon. The others followed her lead, their bodies tense, as if they, too, understood the urgency of the moment. One of them, Zuberi, took a hesitant step forward, sniffing the gauze Kwame had dropped. A test, a question. Was he truly helping? Kwame held his breath as she exhaled and backed away. A silent agreement had been made, but time was running out. The distant call of a hyena shattered the fragile quiet. Another answered, then another. The scavengers had caught the scent of blood, and soon they would come. Kwame knew how this worked. A single wounded lion was an opportunity too great to pass up. If Rafiki couldn't stand, he wouldn't survive the night, and neither would Kwame. Determination flared in his chest. If the rescue team wasn't here yet, he had to act alone. He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap with one hand while gently pressing the rim against Rafiki's lips. The lion's eyes flickered open, tired but aware. Kwame tilted the canteen slightly, letting water trickle into his mouth. At first, Rafiki didn't react, then a flicker of instinct. His tongue moved, lapping up what little he could. The lionesses watched in silence. Amara stepped forward, her gaze sharp, studying the man who had dared to touch their king. Kwame didn't break eye contact. A challenge, a question. Could he be trusted? A long breath passed between them before Amara made her choice. She turned away from him and toward Rafiki, pressing her head gently against his. It was a sign Kwame had seen before, a call to rise, a command from the queen to her king. But Rafiki barely stirred. If he didn't stand soon, it wouldn't matter who protected him. And in the distance, the laughter of hyenas grew louder. The first shadow moved at the edge of the grassland, its yellow eyes glinting in the fading light. Then another, and another. Kwame's stomach tightened. The hyenas had arrived. Their eerie laughter echoed across the plains, a sinister melody that sent a shiver down his spine. They were testing the waters, gauging the strength of the pride. If they sensed weakness, they would attack without hesitation. Rafiki let out a low, strained growl, but it lacked power. He was too weak to stand, too weak to fight. The lionesses bristled, their bodies lowering into defensive stances. Amara bared her teeth, her tail lashing as she let out a deep warning snarl. But Kwame knew how hyenas operated. They wouldn't charge immediately. They would circle, probe, wait for the perfect moment to overwhelm their target. And if Rafiki didn't rise, they would take him. Kwame's mind raced. He had to do something, fast. His rifle was strapped to his back, but using it was a last resort. A gunshot could startle the lionesses as much as the hyenas. Worse, it might make Rafiki panic, draining the last of his strength. No, he needed another way, something to buy them time. Then he spotted it, his flare gun. Slowly, he reached into his belt pouch, careful not to make any sudden moves. The hyenas were watching him now, their ears twitching at every shift. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal. One shot into the air might be enough to startle them, to send them running before they grew too bold. But he had to choose his moment wisely. If he fired too soon, they might just retreat into the shadows, waiting, watching. Then, before he could act, Rafiki stirred. The great lion exhaled sharply and shifted, his massive paws pressing weakly against the ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. Amara moved closer, rubbing her head against his, urging him on. The hyenas hesitated. Their cruel grins faltered. Kwame saw it, doubt. And in the wild, doubt could change everything. But Rafiki wasn't standing yet. And the hyenas weren't leaving. They were still waiting for the moment his strength failed completely. Kwame tightened his grip on the flare gun. It was time to make his move. The tension is at its peak. Kwame has one shot to turn the tide. Will the flare scare the hyenas away? Or is it already too late? What would you do in his place? Let me know in the comments. Kwame's breath was steady, but his heart pounded like a war drum. His fingers tightened around the flare gun, his only chance to shift the odds. The hyenas, now numbering close to a dozen, prowled at the edges of the scene, their bodies low, their eyes locked onto the wounded king. They had smelled blood. They had patience. The lionesses stood in a defensive semicircle, muscles coiled, teeth bared. They were ready to fight. But for how long? If Rafiki couldn't rise, the balance of power would tip, and the scavengers would descend like a storm. A weak growl rumbled in Rafiki's throat, barely more than a whisper of defiance. Amara pressed her head against his, her golden eyes burning with urgency. She was trying to pull him back, to ignite the fire of a warrior who had ruled these lands for years. But even the strongest kings can fall. Kwame clenched his jaw. Seconds. That's all he had. If he hesitated, the hyenas would sense it, and once they did, it would be too late. He lifted the flare gun, pointing it toward the sky. One shot, one chance. He squeezed the trigger. A thunderous crack split the air. The flare ignited, rocketing upward in a blinding streak of red and gold before exploding into a brilliant ball of fire. For an instant, the night became day. The entire savanna was cast in flickering light, stretching shadows across the dry earth. The hyenas recoiled, their cruel grins twisting into expressions of unease. Their laughter faltered, replaced by startled yelps. Some bolted immediately, vanishing into the darkness. Others lingered, torn between fear and hunger. Kwame's pulse thundered in his ears. It was working, but it wasn't enough. The hyenas were waiting, still watching Rafiki, still hoping for a moment of weakness. And then, under the glow of the dying flare, the unthinkable happened. A deep, shuddering breath rattled through Rafiki's chest. His massive paws pressed into the dirt. His legs trembled but held. Amara let out a low, rolling growl. Not a warning, but a command. Kwame could almost feel the weight of her voice. "Get up, my king." And with one final, powerful effort, Rafiki rose. His towering form, scarred but unbroken, loomed over the retreating scavengers. His golden mane caught the last flickers of firelight, transforming him into something more than a lion. He was a legend. The hyenas froze. The spell was broken. The king was not dead. He was not weak. They had lost. One by one, they turned and fled, their cowardly forms vanishing into the night. The lionesses didn't chase them, they didn't need to. The battle had been won. Kwame exhaled, but his relief was short-lived. Rafiki was standing, but for how long? His legs still shook, exhaustion pulling at his massive frame. And in the far distance, beyond the fading echoes of retreating hyenas, came another sound, the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. The rescue team was near, but would they be fast enough? The distant hum of an approaching vehicle sent a jolt of relief through Kwame's chest, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Rafiki was standing, but just barely. His massive frame swayed, his breath shallow and uneven. Blood still oozed from his wounds, dark streaks running down his golden fur. Survival wasn't just about getting up, it was about staying up. And right now, the king of the savannah was dangerously close to falling again. The lionesses remained pressed against him, their bodies acting as a living barricade, a silent force holding him upright. Amara, ever vigilant, let out a low chuff, brushing her head against his. It was both a comfort and a command. "Stay with us." Kwame could see it in her eyes. She understood the stakes. If Rafiki collapsed again, it might be for the last time. The battle with the hyenas had been won, but the war for his life was far from over. The rumbling engine grew louder, headlights piercing the night. Dust kicked up in thick clouds as the vehicle sped toward them, the urgency of the moment written in the reckless speed of its approach. Kwame felt his stomach tighten. How would the pride react to more humans? The last thing he needed was for them to see the rescue team as a new threat. Tension was still thick in the air, a fragile thread that could snap at any second. The truck screeched to a halt a few yards away. Before the engine had even fully died, Dr. Elias Monroe, one of the best wildlife veterinarians Kwame had ever met, jumped out, his sharp blue eyes scanning the situation in seconds. Two assistants followed, carrying medical equipment, their movements precise but cautious. Elias had treated countless wounded animals, but even he seemed to hesitate at the sight before him. His gaze flicked between Kwame, the lionesses, and Rafiki. "You really do know how to find trouble," he muttered, gripping his tranquilizer rifle. Kwame stepped forward, his voice firm. "No sedatives." Elias's brows furrowed. "He's injured, Kwame. If he panics, we could all be in danger." Kwame shook his head. "If you sedate him now, his body might not recover. He's barely holding on." That single statement hung between them like a warning. Elias exhaled sharply, adjusting his grip on the rifle before lowering it slightly. "Then we do this the hard way." Slowly, carefully, the team moved closer. The lionesses didn't retreat. Their muscles tensed, their ears flicking back at the unfamiliar scent of more humans. One wrong move and everything would fall apart. Kwame's heart pounded. Would Rafiki trust them? Or would the instincts of a wounded king push him to fight instead? Kwame could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, thick as the humid night air. Dr. Elias took another slow, calculated step forward, his medical bag slung over one shoulder, his tranquilizer rifle lowered but still in his grip. Every movement had to be perfect. The lionesses stood like sentinels, their sleek bodies forming an unbreakable wall around Rafiki. They had tolerated Kwame, but would they tolerate another human so close to their wounded king? Rafiki let out a low, guttural growl, his powerful frame trembling under its own weight. Even now, battered and bloodied, he was watching. His golden eyes flicked between Elias and his assistants, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He was assessing them, measuring their intentions. Kwame had seen that look before, the look of a predator deciding whether to fight or to let fate take its course. The tension in the air was suffocating. Elias crouched lower, speaking in a calm, steady voice. "I need to clean those wounds, big guy." He reached into his bag, carefully pulling out a vial of antiseptic and a roll of gauze. The sharp scent of alcohol hit the air instantly. Kwame barely had time to react before Rafiki's nostrils flared. A second later, a sound like rolling thunder erupted from his throat. A deep, savage snarl that sent chills down Kwame's spine. Everything happened at once. The lionesses surged forward, not toward the humans, but toward Rafiki, closing ranks around him. They weren't attacking. They were protecting. Amara stood at the front, her ears pinned back, her long tail lashing in warning. Her message was clear: no one gets closer. The others followed suit, their shoulders brushing against Rafiki's, reinforcing the wall of muscle and fur between him and the outsiders. They didn't trust them. Elias swore under his breath. "They won't let us near him." His assistants hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Kwame's mind raced. They didn't have time for this. Rafiki's body had already endured too much. If they lost their chance now, the infection would set in, and he wouldn't last the night. They had to act. But how do you convince a wild animal to let you save its life? Kwame knew there was only one way. He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, positioning himself between Elias and the lionesses. His voice was low, steady. "Rafiki, you have to trust me." The lion's breath was uneven, his legs barely holding him up. The world seemed to hold still. 1 second, 2. Then, something almost imperceptible happened. Rafiki blinked, not in challenge, not in aggression, but in understanding. The lionesses hesitated. Amara's piercing gaze met Kwame's, and then she moved. Not far, just a few inches, but it was enough. The others followed, creating a small opening. It wasn't an invitation, not entirely. It was a test, a fragile truce. Kwame swallowed hard, stepping through the gap. He was now inches from Rafiki, close enough to feel the lion's heat radiating from his battered body. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the antiseptic, his heart hammering. If Rafiki changed his mind, if the lionesses changed theirs, it would all be over in seconds. The night held its breath. Kwame's breaths were slow and controlled, but inside, his heart pounded like distant thunder. He was inches away from Rafiki now, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the lion's battered body. The lionesses had given him just enough space to work, but their presence was still suffocating. 6 sets of piercing golden eyes tracked his every move, their muscles tight, their tails flicking with unease. They had tolerated his presence, but their patience was razor-thin. Dr. Elias remained a few feet back, his assistants frozen in place, their fingers hovering over the medical supplies. They had seen dangerous animals before, but nothing like this, nothing that felt so personal, so intimate. If they moved too soon, if they broke the unspoken agreement between man and beast, everything would unravel. The lionesses weren't just watching Rafiki, they were watching Kwame. Trust was a fragile thing, and it wouldn't survive a mistake. Kwame carefully reached for the bottle of antiseptic and unscrewed the cap. The sharp, stinging scent filled the air almost immediately. Rafiki's nostrils flared. His ears twitched, and a deep, rumbling growl vibrated through his ribs. Kwame hesitated. The lion wasn't challenging him, not yet, but pain could turn even the strongest animal unpredictable. He swallowed hard and tipped the bottle, letting the antiseptic spill over the deep wounds along Rafiki's shoulder. The reaction was instant. Rafiki flinched, his massive claws flexing against the dirt. A deep, guttural snarl tore from his throat, and his body tensed as if he might lunge. Kwame didn't move. He didn't recoil, didn't drop his gaze. This moment wasn't about fear, it was about trust. But the lionesses didn't see it that way. Amara's ears flattened against her skull, and a sharp warning growl cut through the night. The others mirrored her, their bodies lowering, their tails whipping furiously behind them. They didn't understand what was happening. All they saw was their king in pain, and Kwame was the one causing it. For a single, breathless second, Kwame thought they might attack. His muscles tightened, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. But running wasn't an option. If he showed weakness, the fragile balance would collapse. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed still. "Easy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands never wavered. His posture remained steady. This wasn't a fight. It was a negotiation. A conversation between man and beast, one built on something deeper than words. And then Rafiki exhaled. His body slumped slightly, his eyes still burning with pain but lacking aggression. It wasn't defeat. It was acceptance. He wasn't fighting anymore. Amara's growl softened. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it shifted, settling into something else. A silent acknowledgement. Kwame had passed the test. Behind him, Dr. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "We can't waste this chance," he muttered, already reaching for his supplies. "We need stitches, fluids, fast." But before Kwame could respond, a distant sound shattered the silence. A deep, rolling vibration growing louder by the second. Another vehicle, and it was coming straight for them. The distant roar of an approaching vehicle sent a shockwave through the already fragile balance of the moment. Headlights pierced the darkness, bouncing wildly over the uneven terrain as the engine rumbled closer. Kwame's breath hitched. Who else was coming? Was it backup from the reserve or something worse? Poachers, scavengers, or outsiders who wouldn't understand how delicate this situation had become. The lionesses reacted instantly. Amara's head snapped toward the approaching threat, her golden eyes narrowing, her body shifting into a defensive stance. The others followed her lead, muscles tensed, their attention now divided between their wounded king and the unknown force barreling toward them. They had accepted Kwame's presence, but this was different. Rafiki stirred at the disturbance, his ears twitching, his exhausted frame rising just slightly. Even in his weakened state, his instincts hadn't left him. A new danger was coming, and he was still a king, one who would never surrender without a fight. Kwame turned to Elias. "We need to move now." There was no time to debate. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the situation spiraled out of control. Elias didn't hesitate, snapping into action. He grabbed a syringe filled with antibiotics, his assistant holding an 4-bag with much-needed fluids. They had to work fast. The vehicle skidded to a stop, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. Kwame's hands curled into fists as he braced for whatever came next. The driver's side door flew open, and a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Took you long enough." Kwame's stomach unclenched slightly as David, another senior ranger from the reserve, stepped out. Relief flickered through him, but it didn't last long. The lionesses weren't relieved. They didn't know David. To them, he was just another intruder. Amara let out a warning snarl, her tail lashing furiously. This was too much. Too many humans. Too much change. They had allowed Kwame to help, but how much further would their trust stretch? "Stay back," Kwame barked at David, raising a hand. "Any sudden moves, and this ends badly." David hesitated, clearly confused, but he didn't argue. Kwame turned back to Rafiki, knowing they had only one shot. "Just a little longer, old man," he murmured. Elias worked quickly, sliding the needle into Rafiki's thick skin, injecting the antibiotics before carefully placing the 4. The lion tensed, his eyes flickering open, but he didn't fight it. The lionesses watched with cautious eyes, their bodies still tight with unease. But they didn't stop him. That was the only permission they were going to get. Minutes passed like hours. The medicine was in, the worst was over. But the hardest part was yet to come. Rafiki had to survive the night. Then something remarkable happened. Amara stepped forward and pressed her head against Rafiki's. A deep, soothing chuff rumbled between them. The others followed, surrounding their king, their presence a shield of unspoken loyalty. Kwame stepped back. His part was done. Now it was up to Rafiki and the wild itself. David exhaled. Think he's gonna make it? Kwame watched as Rafiki, despite everything, lifted his head just slightly higher. Not in defiance, not in weakness, but in quiet strength. He nodded. Yeah, he's gonna make it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video. It helps us bring more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell to never miss an update. Do you think animals can feel gratitude? Tell us in the comments. Share this video with friends and family.